everybody. So this talk is based on a multimedia documentary artwork that I'm preparing for my MFA thesis at the Art Institute of Boston. It's called the Peabody Project. And I'm using some of that work to make a fairly simple point today, but one that benefits from a few visuals. So let me start by asking you all to participate in a little visioning exercise, okay? Imagine that you go to some small Massachusetts industrial city at random. You drive around. Maybe you get out for a stretch or a snack or dinner at some local joint. Maybe you take a walk. And what might you see? Perhaps a house, a repurposed factory, a commercial building, and a monument. What do these structures mean to you? And what do they tell you about the place and its people? Well, nothing much, right? So maybe you finish your reverie with some offhand remark to no one in particular like, what a dump, why would anyone want to live here? And I'm sure that reaction is the most common one that my hometown of Peabody, Massachusetts gets from people driving through it as quickly as possible on their way to more scenic or ostensibly historic locales. Because a place like Peabody, a working class city with a middle class suburban periphery, doesn't have an interesting history, right? I mean, even those that grew up there didn't hear much about the place to recommend it, inasmuch as we heard anything at all about it at home or in school. Because all we knew was that Peabody had been famous for its leather industry. I say had been, because the leather factories were already on their way out in the 1960s when we were babies, and mostly gone by the late 1970s. A lot of us had grandparents, or even parents, like that one, that had worked in the leather factories, but they never talked much about the experience, and that was it. So effectively, my friends and I were strangers in our own city. But that wasn't anything like a real history of Peabody. That's just all we were told. By our families, yes, but also by unionized teachers. More to the point, teachers that had just founded a union local shortly before my generation started school. And these newly unionized teachers in a public school system in a working class city never said a word about the fact that Peabody's leather industry had been fundamentally improved by the rise of a powerful progressive trade union that, while far from perfect, helped raise the living standards of the entire community for 2 generations. That union was built by my grandfather and his generation in the cauldron of a tremendous struggle that began with a brutal general strike of 5,000 workers in 1933. And it went on to dominate city politics until the 1950s. That union, Local 21, was just in its last legs while my friends and I were in grade school, having suffered the death of 1,000 internal and external cuts from the McCarthy era onwards. And that union wasn't worth a mention by a single unionized teacher in the 1970s. And I seriously doubt that it was mentioned by any unionized teacher except in the most cursory way from the 1980s to this day. Because people stopped talking about it long ago, and new generations don't know it existed. And all too many union members, teachers included, treat unions like some kind of trade association or club that they don't want to bore friends and families with. And then today's union leaders wonder why Americans don't support the labor movement. So why would Americans support something they've never been taught about? And that most people in most communities don't have any experience with and don't ever hear discussed in any venue except by enemies of labor in the most derisive, dismissive terms possible. So, here's my wicked smart idea for you all. And it's not a surprise in this forum. Perhaps it might be in the best interest of the beleaguered labor movement, and specifically unionized teachers like yourselves, beset by enemies on all sides, CEOs and Republicans and talk show hosts, oh my. Perhaps it might be good for you to start teaching your students about labor unions, if you're not already. And spending more time talking about important lessons from local history. The real local history. Not just the hagiographies of the rich and powerful. History that includes discussion of the lives and works of the vast majority of working people that built this country. I understand that it will be difficult to do this. I realize that in an age of teaching to the test, textbooks redacted by Texan theocrats, school committees stacked with Tea Party reactionaries, and with austerity being the order of the day, that teachers have their work cut out for them just to give a decent education to an already distracted internet generation. But perhaps in talking about this local history, some of which you will doubtless have to unearth on your own, as I have had to do, perhaps by doing it you will discover some lessons that working families, including your own, will find useful in the present day. For example, let's take a look at those photos again and rethink what we're looking at in the context of the local working class history I'm bringing to light in Peabody. This house was the house that my father was born in. That is to say, the house containing the small apartment that my father's entire family lived in. And the only wage earner in those years was my grandfather. And the only work available to him was long, dangerous, hard work in Peabody's leather factories. This factory was the A.C. Lawrence factory, once the largest leather factory in the United States and possibly in the world. This factory was the focus of the 1933 general strike, which saw men, women, and children fighting scabs and the cops that protected the scabs in protracted street battles for almost 6 weeks. Corporate globalization killed it and the American leather industry by the 1970s. This commercial building was the first headquarters of the local and national union that emerged from the 1933 general strike, Local 21 of the National Leather Workers Association. And this monument, well, that was supposed to be the pedestal to a statue dedicated to the leather workers of Peabody in the early 1990s. But the city never built the statue, leaving just the pedestal in front of a small park that is rarely used by anyone. So much does my hometown value working class history. And what do we learn from these photos in their proper historical context? That regular working class people like my grandfather organized into collective democratic organizations in their own political economic self-interest, beat back concerted assaults by the local powers that be, and managed to improve their family's lot for decades in the process. And if they can do it, we can do it. In closing, let me leave you with this thought. If the working families of places like Peabody, children and parents alike, knew more about their own local history, wouldn't they have a more favorable view of labor unions like the Mass Teachers Association? And wouldn't they be more likely to join the labor movement in its struggles to build a just and democratic society in place of the corporate-dominated kleptocracy that is early 21st century America? Mull that over and get back to me, thanks.